The human climbed the jagged cliffs, her boots scraping against stones, sending tiny clouds of dust into the wind. She paused for a moment, feeling the cold bite at her fingers and the sting of the wind whipping her face. The mountains stretched endlessly, around her peaks jutting like broken teeth into the sky, and she felt both awe and fear in the same breath. Beneath her she heard a faint sound, a soft high whimper that made her stop and strain her ears. The sound came again, and it was so small and desperate that it made her heart tighten. She leaned over the edge of the cliff, peering down through the mist and the shadows, and there she saw it, a small dragon hatchling no larger than a fox, tangled in a cluster of thorns, its scales flickering like tiny flames against the gray rock. The hatchling lifted its head, trembling, and opened its mouth in a silent cry, and the human could see the fear shining in its eyes. The winds roared around them, threatening to knock her off balance, but she took a careful step closer, extending her hand, slowly, not wanting to startle the fragile creature. Her fingers brushed against the dragon scales, and she felt the heat radiating from its tiny body. The hatchling froze for a moment, then pressed its small body closer to her hand, as if testing her intentions. Her heart pounded, and she whispered soft sounds of comfort that disappeared into the roaring wind. She crouched carefully, pulling a long branch from the rocks to lift the thorns gently. One by one she worked her way around the creature, careful not to tear its delicate wings. When the last thorn fell away, the hatchling let out a tiny shiver and pressed its head against her chest. She cradled it carefully, feeling its rapid heartbeat against her own. She could feel the heat and the fear and the raw life pulsing in her hands. She looked up at the jagged sky and felt a surge of protectiveness stronger than anything she had ever known. She knew that taking it back down the cliffs would be dangerous, that every step could bring disaster, yet she could not leave it here to face the hunters or the cold of the night. She adjusted the hatchling in her arms and began to plan the careful descent, knowing that this small, fragile life was now in her hands, and that her choices would ripple far beyond the cliffs into a world that did not yet understand the bond forming between them. The human pressed the hatchling closer, feeling its small body quiver against her chest. As the wind tugged at her hair and whipped across the cliffside, she whispered soft words that disappeared into the roar of the mountains. Hoping the fragile creature would understand her intentions, the hatchling lifted its tiny head and blinked with wide eyes that reflected both fear and curiosity. It nuzzled against her neck, curling its claws lightly around her sleeve as if claiming her as its own. She shifted her weight, carefully testing the stability of the rocks below, and took slow, cautious steps along the narrow ledges, each movement deliberate so as not to startle the hatchling. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the cliffs in shades of blood and gold, and the shadows lengthened, making the mountains feel endless and alive. She hummed a gentle tune, a rhythm she remembered from childhood, a sound that seemed to settle the hatchling, its wings twitching softly in time with her heartbeat. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the scent of stone and fire, and the warmth of the tiny dragon against her chest. She imagined the dangers waiting below, the hunters with their spears and torches, the village men who would see the hatchling as a prize or a threat, and her resolve hardened. She would not let them take this life, not now, not ever. She brushed a lock of hair from her face and looked down at the fragile creature, trusting her completely, and in that trust she felt a courage she had never known before. A silent promise passed between them that no matter the cost she would guide it to safety, and the hatchling chirped softly, a sound of relief and recognition as if it understood the vow, and together they moved forward along the cliffside, the wind pushing against them, yet neither faltering, each step carrying them closer to the hidden cave. She had heard whispers of a place where dragon eggs slept untouched for centuries, a sanctuary she prayed still existed, and as the shadows swallowed the peaks, the bond between human and hatchling grew, unspoken yet unbreakable. From the valley below came harsh voices, echoing against the cliffs like jagged knives. The human froze for a heartbeat, her chest tightening as she listened. The hunters were shouting their words, sharp and demanding, their eyes glinting with greed and fear. They had seen her carrying the hatchling, and now they wanted it for the king of dragons. The wind carried their threats up the mountain, and the hatchling shivered in her arms, pressing its tiny body against her, as if seeking protection. She tightened her hold and took a deep breath, knowing any sudden movement could draw the hunters closer or startle the fragile creature. She crouched low behind a jut of rock, peering down, trying to calculate the safest path downward. The hunters stomped through the brush, their voices growing louder and more impatient every second, their spears catching the dying light as they waved them. Threateningly, the human's mind raced. She could feel the thrum of her heartbeat matching the rapid pulse of the hatchling against her chest. She could not let them take it, not for anything in the world. She scanned the cliffside looking for hidden footholds and narrow paths only she could navigate. The hunters would not follow easily, but their shouts carried, and each echo made the hatchling twitch in fear. She whispered a soft hum, trying to calm the creature, her fingers brushing over its scales, feeling the tiny tremors the hunters were getting closer, and the danger grew palpable. She felt a surge of determination so strong, it burned in her chest. She would protect this life, even if it meant climbing blind across unstable ledges or facing the hunters directly. She adjusted her grip and took a cautious step forward, the hatchling chirping softly, as if understanding the promise, in the wind howled around them, carrying the voices of danger down the cliffs. And the human knew that every movement from this moment on would require all her strength, cunning, and courage, if the hatchling was to survive the night. The human took a careful breath, feeling the weight of the hatchling against her chest and the cold bite of the wind against her face. She glanced down at the hunters, their shouts growing faintly as they tried to find a path up the cliffs. She knew they would not give up easily. Every step would be a risk. Yet she had no choice. She could not leave the hatchling to them. Her eyes searched the jagged rock for hidden ledges, narrow paths, and crevices that might offer a way to descend safely. The hatchling squirmed slightly in her arms, and she whispered soft words of reassurance, guiding its tiny head against her shoulder. The cliffs dropped sharply beneath them, jagged stones jutting like broken teeth into the shadows. She moved slowly, testing each foothold with care, and every gust of wind threatened to throw her off balance. She clenched her jaw and pressed forward, knowing that hesitation could mean disaster. She recalled the stories of a hidden cave deep within the mountains, a sanctuary where old dragon eggs lay untouched for centuries, a place no human had found and fewer hunters could reach. She focused on that thought, on the promise of safety and shelter for the hatchling. Her boots slipped once on loose stone, and she caught herself with a grunt. The hatchling chirped softly, as if sensing the danger, and pressed closer to her chest. She adjusted her grip and moved again, each careful step a test of balance and courage. The wind whipped harder now, carrying the echoes of the hunters' voices like distant thunder. The cliffs seemed endless and alive, as if they were conspiring against her. She forced herself to concentrate on the tiny path before her, imagining the warmth and safety of the hidden cave, and the gentle beating of the hatchling against her chest gave her strength. She would not falter. She would not let this small life be taken, and she pressed forward toward the hidden sanctuary, knowing that the choice she had made could change everything for the hatchling, and perhaps for herself. The cave opened before her like a secret carved from stone. Shadows, twisting along the walls as she stepped inside. The air was thick and warm, carrying the scent of smoke and something older than mountains, older than time herself. She froze as massive shapes emerged from the darkness. Dragons larger than any she had imagined, their scales glinting like molten metal, and their eyes glowing like liquid gold. They circled slowly, watching her every movement. The hatchling whimpered softly in her arms and pressed closer to her chest. The dragon's wings stirred the air like storms, sweeping dust and echoes around them. She lowered her eyes and whispered gently, trying to show she meant no harm. The dragons tilted their heads silently, their presence both terrifying and majestic. She could feel the power in the air, their breaths like heat waves, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Every heartbeat echoed in the cavern as she stood frozen, knowing that a single wrong move could end everything. She lowered her eyes and let the hatchling rest lightly against her chest, feeling the tremor of its tiny body. She spoke softly, her voice carrying into the cavern like a fragile wind. I mean no harm. I only wish to protect this young one from danger, from hunters, from those who would see it destroyed. The dragons circled above, their massive wings stirring the air into waves that made her hair whip around her face. She felt the heat from their scales, and the intensity of their gaze weighing down on her, yet she did not flinch. She held the hatchling closer and continued speaking with a steady calm that surprised even herself. It is not its fault. It is too young to understand the world around it. It needs care and safety, not punishment, and I can provide that. I will not abandon it. I will not let it suffer. She could see the dragons pause, their massive heads tilting, as if considering her words, their eyes bright and piercing yet not unkind. The cave hummed with the sound of their whispers and the flutter of wings as they debated among themselves. The human could feel the tension like electricity. She swallowed the lump in her throat and added softly, I understand your laws. I know that humans have caused harm to dragons in the past, but this is different. This is a life that cannot defend itself. fully, yet it can feel, and it can grow, and it can trust, and I will honor that trust with my life." She held the hatchling high slightly so it could see the dragons and chirped, softly mimicking the sounds it had made when it first trusted her, and in that moment, something shifted. The dragons murmured among themselves, a low vibration that made the stone beneath her feet hum, a silent dialogue that carried respect and curiosity. She could feel it like a current through her bones, and for the first time she dared to hope that they might understand that her courage was not recklessness, and that her care for the hatchling was a bond worthy of honor, a bond older than law, older than fear. And she waited, holding the small life in her arms, ready to accept whatever judgment the dragons would make, knowing that her actions could change the world for this young dragon, and perhaps for all of them. The dragons murmured among themselves, their voices low and vibrating through the stone. The human watched every flick of their wings, every tilt of their massive heads, sensing the weight of their deliberation. The air was thick with centuries of law and tradition, old rules that punished humans who touched dragon young, yet she could feel a shift in the current of their thoughts, as if her words had stirred something long forgotten. The oldest dragon stepped closer, its scales dark as midnight and eyes glowing like molten gold. It circled slowly above her, and the hatchling, she felt the heat of its gaze and the subtle vibration of power pulsing through the cavern. She tightened her grip on the hatchling, and whispered softly, reassuringly, that it would be all right. The council spoke in low harmonics that resonated through her chest, a dialogue of thought, rather than sound, recalling the ancient times when dragons and humans had shared trust and respect. When bonds had been forged by care and courage, not fear and domination. They debated silently through gestures and vibrations. The human could not fully understand their words, yet she could feel the rhythm of agreement and doubt, the tension between past and present. The wind stirred from their wings, creating patterns of shadow on the walls of the cave. She pressed the hatchling closer, feeling its tiny heartbeat quicken, as if it too sensed the monumental decision unfolding above them. The oldest dragon hovered still, its eyes locking with hers, and in that gaze she saw not just judgment, but curiosity, and the faintest trace of understanding, as if the echoes of her courage and compassion had reached through the layers of ancient law and begun to unearth something new, something that could reshape the future of both human and dragon. Finally, the oldest dragon stepped forward, its massive wings folding slowly against its body, the cavern vibrating with the hum of power as it raised its head high and spoke in a voice that carried through stone and air. "Any human who protects a hatchling shall not be harmed, and any dragon who witnesses such care shall honor it, and all shall learn to respect the bond between guardian and young." The words rolled through the cave like molten fire. The other dragons circled closer, their eyes gleaming with agreement. Murmurs of approval echoing from scales and wings. The air seemed to shimmer as the ancient laws shifted, bending and stretching to include this new truth. The human lowered the hatchling, slowly letting it peek over her shoulder at the council, its tiny claws twitching in curiosity. The dragons moved with grace and power around them, acknowledging the change that her courage had inspired. For centuries humans had been forbidden from touching their young, and yet here was proof that compassion could exist without fear, and that care could bind rather than harm. The cavern felt alive with a new energy. The hatchling chirped softly and nudged her hand, and the dragons responded with gentle vibrations that brushed against her senses like a warm wind. She realized that she had not only protected this life, but helped reshape the very laws that governed the mountains and the skies. She pressed the hatchling closer, feeling its warmth and trust, and for the first time in her life she understood that her choices rippled far beyond herself, that courage could carve new paths, and that even the oldest and most powerful beings could learn to change the world if they listened closely enough to the heart. The human carefully carried the hatchling back toward the nest hidden deep in the shadows of the cave. The air was thick with warmth and the soft hum of dragons above. As they circled the peaks and valleys, the young dragon chirped nervously but pressed its tiny body closer to her chest, trusting her completely. For the first time, she felt the weight of responsibility shift into a quiet pride, knowing she had kept it safe and changed the rules that had bound the mountains. For centuries, the dragons above soared, gracefully weaving through the sky, their wings casting shadows across the cliffs like living banners of the new law. She watched as their massive forms glinted in the sunlight, each movement a silent acknowledgement of respect and trust. The hatchling nuzzled against her shoulder and lifted its small head to look at her, eyes bright with recognition and gratitude. She knelt and gently placed it in the nest, surrounded by the soft warmth of stones and moss. The hatchling chirped softly and flapped its tiny wings, as if testing the freedom She had fought to give it the human smiled brushing. A lock of hair from her face, feeling the stir of wind from the dragon's wings above, and the quiet pulse of life around her, she stepped back and looked to the sky. The dragons circled in patterns of light and shadow, a dance of harmony, now binding humans and dragons through understanding and courage. She knew that the bond she had formed with this young life would never be broken, that the echoes of this moment would travel through generations, and that the mountains themselves seemed to breathe a quiet song of change and hope. The hatchling chirped again, and the human whispered softly a vow to protect and honor this life, and every wing beat above carried a promise that trust and courage could reshape the world.